Hi, welcome. My name is Allan Wade, and tonight we're going to be discussing the universal flood of Noah, the 13 marks of evidence. And I'll be passing around some sample rocks in my collection to show you those marks of the flood. And hopefully you'll learn them all today. So this is from the Universal Model, A New Millennial Science. This book recently came out, and I am the presenter, Allan Wade. The author of the book was told in 1990 that he would never, his professor from the university said, there will never be any scientific evidence of the universal flood. And if you look on Google, it says it's a myth. So the question is, did Noah's flood really happen? Or, and is there any scientific evidence? And so this is actually what started him on the process of writing this book in 1990. He says he had the idea of it on that sidewalk right there. And so let's define what a universal flood is. It's floodwaters covering the entire surface of the earth, including all mountains, for about a year's time. It occurred about a little more than 4,000 years ago, as recorded in history. There is natural, geological, chemical, and biological events confirming that it happened. And the universal flood is the largest natural disaster ever to occur in the history of mankind. And it's the most universal. In other words, happened all over the world. So that's what we're saying about the universal flood. And the modern science, because they have been denying this for the past 150 years, is in what we call the dark age of geology. And so we're trying to come out of that dark age of geology. So modern science has already admitted that the earth has been flooded. And here's one quote that says, sea level was several hundred feet higher than it is today. And if that was true in North America, so that the entire center of the continent was flooded, well, wouldn't that be happening in other parts of the world as well? And so usually modern science says that it was a small, shallow flood locally, and that they happened at different times. But we're suggesting that they all happened at one time and all over the earth. The mechanism of the flood is very specific, and this is in the Universal Model, Chapter 8, and Subchapter 3 goes through the mechanism of the flood and talks about the unusual catastrophic event that triggered it, which they say was a comet that passed close enough to the Earth not to hit it, but to disrupt the spin of the Earth so that the rotation rate was reduced. And when the rotation rate was reduced, the balance between centripetal force and from rotation and the gravitational force was imbalanced, and so the continents sank in towards the center of the earth about 5 miles, and the water erupted out. So that's it's sinking, and so these Hydra fountains were like giant geysers where the water's being forced through cracks and fault lines in the earth. And so the water then rose, and the earthquake activity from all those fault lines breaking up caused a lot of heat, which created the conditions for the flood. And then later it got back to normal. So the universal chapter then now has, it starts on page 476 and goes to page 698. So that's 222 pages of evidence on the flood. And actually, a lot of the pages before that are setting the stage for it. So you could almost say that the whole book, with more than 998 pages, is evidence of the flood in one way or another. So his professor was wrong, is my point. The crystallization process, all natural crystalline minerals are formed in water. And so this is an experiment that we talked about a month or two ago in an earlier chapter, but I think it's essential to present here because this is kind of the foundation of how we can argue that all of these evidences relate to the flood. We took a small quartz crystal and wrapped it in wire, and a whole string of wires that we put into a pipe. That pipe was then put into an oven, which was put into a concrete protective area. And the oven had a heating element so that the heat and the water would actually flow and circulate from the bottom to the top, because it was hotter at the bottom and cooler at the top. And so it caused a current to flow through the pipe. And so the crystal grew nearly double in size in one day. But the conditions that this was in is very specific. And it had to have a lot of pressure. And when we looked around for the scientific term that we should use to discuss what the conditions are, we couldn't find it. And so we actually had to make up a new word, hypertherm. So hydro is for the water, pre is for the pressure, and therm is for the thermal heat. And this is the kind of environment that these crystals grew in. And it's the kind of environment that quartz crystals grow in. And one of the ways we know that is because people can make quartz crystals. And so I'll pass around this man-made quartz crystal. And you'll see in the center, the line there is what we call a seed crystal. It's something that the crystal starts growing off of, and then it grew and expanded. And it was in more than 10,000 pounds of pressure. And so we'll pass that around. And then these two are other quartz-based crystals that were grown in the labs in Ohio. And you can see very pretty crystals, very similar to the kinds of crystals that you find naturally. And this was actually the one that gave them the idea that they could do that, the pinkish one, because it was in a place, an autoclave, similar to the one that we used, only on a bigger scale because they were doing it to produce crystals for computers. Okay, so that's the environment. So that hyperthermal environment, in order to get 13,395 pounds per square inch, PSI, that, and you can go on the internet and calculate the conversions, in order to get that much pressure, like you've felt the pressure when you go swimming in a swimming pool and you dive down deep to the bottom, right? Do you feel the pressure on your ears? Okay. So that pressure that you feel is because of the amount of water above you. So how deep do you think your swimming pool has to be to have 13,395 pounds per square inch? Yeah, it is 5.5 miles, 30,000 feet. Okay, so that's enough to cover Mount Everest. And so in order to have that much pressure to form the quartz crystals that we find all over the surface of the Earth, then there had to be a time where there was 5 miles or 30,000 feet of water above the surface of the Earth. And that would be true in the Arizona desert here, like where the petrified forest is, because it's forcing the silica-rich minerals into the wood so that it can change it into stone. Okay, so so that's how we argue that the flood happened, and that the way that quartz-based crystals are made is in this kind of environment, and so they were made during the flood. And so with that argument, then we would say that all petrified wood and all fossils were formed during the flood. And so these are some of the things that quartz growth experiment teaches us. We're going to focus today on number 6, which is the evidences called the marks of the flood. So, and that's what I call the rock-solid evidence of the flood. You know, because if you found a boat, like Noah's Ark, people would argue whether it was really Noah's Ark or somebody else's boat, right? But this evidence really will stand up scientifically because it's based on the amount of pressure that's required to form the rocks that we find everywhere. Okay? And based on that information, then we can make arguments about a lot of different rocks. So this hypertherm conditions is very important and only happened one time, and so that's why we can say Noah's flood is a fact. Now, with my students, I actually had them make little rock kits to help them learn these 13 marks of the flood. I had them get an egg carton so they could start a little rock collection and put at least 12 of them. One of the marks is diamond, and I figured we're not going to be buying kids diamonds, so they could do without that one. They could grab their mom's finger and show if they've got a wedding ring that has a diamond. So, and you, well, here, I'll just go ahead and pass this around. So we have all of the marks of the flood listed here, corresponding with the rock that is in that kit. Okay, so now, and I was really excited when I did this. I actually found that this is the easiest way to learn these, because I had been studying this and teaching this and was having a hard time remembering all these things. But when I put it this way, I realized, hey, they kind of like go together in groups of 2. And so it's kind of like you only have to remember 6 things instead of trying to memorize 13 things. And so these are the things I'm actually going to be testing you on these at the end. So pay attention. But it's an open book test, yeah. So, and you can take your notes. So the first 2 are suspended floaters. No rocks are attached. In other words, they're not growing off of a rock like most quartz crystals have a rock at the bottom and they grow up and off of it. The second 2, think of moving, like erosion from the mountains and then going down into the depths of the ocean. The white ones, carbonate and salt. The fossil fuels, oil and gas and coal. The metals appear valuable like gold. That's pyrite, and then ores, whether it's copper, gold, or silver ore. And then prepositions is the last one. You think of the prepositions on, below, or inside, because the surface mark is on the top of the surface. Diamonds actually form deeper down in the diatremes, so they're below the surface of the earth. And then inside is inclusions that are actually inside the crystal rocks. So we'll be seeing all those as we go through and talk about the universal flood model. So up to 95% of the Earth's marine species disappeared at the end of the Permian period. Some 70% of land species, including plants, insects, vertebrates, also perished. And it's arguably the single most important event in biology, but there's no consensus about what happened. And a big part of that is because a lot of scientists don't want to admit that there was a flood. So the first one is the Hydra fountain mark, and before we really get into this too deep, we need to know what a Hydra fountain is. And if you're familiar with the universal model, you've heard that word often, but for other people, you may have never heard it. So Hydra fountains are kind of like geysers, but they could be much, much larger. And so this is kind of showing you what it might look at from space if a whole fault line just kind of breaks up and water starts gushing out of the fault line, where the plate edges are. It's a lot bigger than a volcano, and it would be shooting water extremely high. And as an example, here's one that we have a picture of from Enceladus, which is one of the moons of, let's see, is it Saturn or Jupiter? Is it Jupiter? It's Saturn or Jupiter. Moons of, I think it's Saturn. But I hope I'm right there. Anyway, over here on the side, this is a picture showing how big that Hydra fountain is. And if you look at the distance of how big the moon is, Enceladus is, compared to the Hydra fountain, I mean, it's almost as big as the moon itself. And you notice on the picture here, there's a lot of cracks, lines, where steam and carbon-based molecules are coming up.
Saturn.
Thank you very much. It is Saturn. Okay. So I was right, I think. All right. The Hydra fountain mark, the rock that I use to illustrate this, and on most of these, I'm trying to help you learn the 13 marks of the flood. So I'm picking one rock usually as one that we can put in the rock kit, we can look at, we can handle, we can say, this is one evidence of the flood. But in the chapters in the universal model, there's lots of pages, and there's multiple types of rocks that could be put in there and other things. So it's hard to identify just one, but these are the ones that I picked. These particular rocks are called fluorite crystals, and I'll go ahead and pass these around so you can look at them. Some of them are more greenish, like that one.
They have fluorite in them?
And they do have fluorine in. But, there's other things there. So they, I'm not sure exactly the chemical composition of them, but...
You said fluorite.
But fluorite is the name of the crystal, and that element would be in there with the other minerals that are in there. And they have a very characteristic shape that has 8 sides, because it's kind of like 2 pyramids that are bottom to bottom to each other. And there's no rock attachment. That's one of the significant things that you need to pay attention to, because the rocks in the Hydra fountain mark are usually ones that are suspended by the water coming out of the center of the earth. So double terminated quartz crystals could fit in here, that you can find up near Payson at Diamond Point. And so it's a double terminated. And so I call them floaters, but usually when you think of floating, you think of something on top of the water, but these are actually just suspended in the water, a little above the surface, but with another 5 miles of water on top of them. Okay? So the water is still flowing out from the center of the earth underneath them, pushing them up, kind of like this blow dryer experiment. You can see here the ping pong ball is way up here, the blow dryer is way down here, but what's keeping that up? It's the air flowing up is equal to the force of gravity pulling it down. Okay? So these fluorite crystals, think of them being pushed or floating up, and so they're suspended in the water, probably under about 5 miles of water, but they're still above the ground, being pushed up as they're forming and growing. And if they double in size every day, then a lot of those, maybe a week or two to form those fluorite crystals that we're passing around.
And then do they just fall onto the...
And then eventually they'll...
Too heavy
Yeah, they'll get too heavy and they'll fall down, yeah. Aragonite is another one that I kind of picture like the big ping pong ball, right? But that's because there's no rock attachment, so it had to be suspended as it was being formed. So it probably started just on a little grain of sand or a little dust particle, and then started to grow and crystallize in its characteristic shape. To demonstrate the Hydra fountains, I used the Mentos geyser experiment. What I did was I attached a ice cream bucket that I put dirt in too, so that it would shoot out through the dirt, and you can see this is at the beginning, and the Coke bottle's pretty full, and then this it's about half empty, and here it's most of the Coke has been pushed out because the Mentos candy that you drop into it causes it to change to steam, or to carbon gas. The carbonation from it to come out. So it pushes the liquid out because the carbonation is changing from being in solution, coming out of solution.
So how did you do it? Did you just
There's a little mechanism that I purchased called the Mentos degeyser tube, and you stack up about 7 little Mentos candies in there, and when you pull the plug, as I am doing or just did in that picture, I just did it in the first picture, then they drop down in and start that reaction that makes all the carbonation come out of solution and basically explode. A diet, most sodas would work, but the diet sodas tend to work better for some reason, reacting with the Mentos. Yeah. One of the fun things about this then is that I then took that and I said, well, let's see if we can, because one of the things that the UM talks about is that they have fossilized hydro fountains. And just to let you know the size, there's a little person right here. Okay, so that's how big a person is compared to this hydro fountain. Okay, now, so these are fossilized hydro fountains, which means that instead of a hole in the ground, sometimes we call them lava tubes, where there's a big hole in the ground, but they were probably hydro fountain holes, right? But sometimes the dirt and sand settles back down inside the hole. And then what happened with these is after that sand settled back in, then the crystals formed because it's under 5 miles of water from the flood. And so these are now changing into sandstone. And this one's still partially open, so you can still see where the tube was, the hole was, but it got cemented around it on the outside where it was slower, kind of like sluggish arteries, I guess.
So those probably grew after?
So during the flood, but after the original explosion, right? So it blows a big hole in the ground, right? I mean, this one, that hole here, let's see, 6, I mean, that's going to be 20 feet at least in diameter. And then the sand settled back in, and because it's under 5 miles of water of the flood, then quartz crystals can start to grow and cement all those sand particles together into sandstone. And then what happens is, and I think I have that on a later slide. I guess I don't. It's in a picture in the book. The mud or dirt gets washed away around it, and the pillar of sandstone is still standing then. So that's what happened with these. You had a question?
Yeah, how did this stuff around it get washed away?
So probably when the floodwaters receded after the flood, as the ground is coming back up and the floodwaters recede, then they can wash away a lot of dirt like they did in the Grand Canyon.
they can't grow outward like the mountain does?
So, well, certainly there's huge sheets of sandstone all over the surface of the earth, but these particular ones are in tubes or pipes because that's where a hydro fountain exploded, and then it crystallized
Not above it, but it crystallized
inside the hole.
around it.
And then
Washed away because it was loose.
Right. And so I actually tried to do an experiment with this. And so after I did that Mentos geyser experiment that we showed you, I put, what's that paste? Plaster Paris down in the hole. And then washed away. This is a picture of us washing away the dirt around it. And you can see the little white in the center of that is my fossilized hydro fountain. And I'll show you, that's what it looked like here. So on the far left, there's one that has the hole, and you can see it's a cone shaped, right? At the top, as that fluid comes up through the crack, it kind of blows the top part out, so you get a funnel-shaped diatreme. That's a word that we used last month, I think. And then, let me go back. So there you can see it's a little wider at the top and funnel-shaped, and then here's the pole with a little wider top. You can see it here too. So here's the shaft, and then here's at the top where it was a little wider because of that diatreme shape. Okay, so there's my plaster fossilized hydro fountain model, and the dirt here has been, the top part of it has been washed away. So you can see here it's lower. So there's before and this is after. They're actually two different experiments, but there you get to see it at two different stages. Okay, so I'm just kind of showing you. So in addition to the floaters, like the suspended fluorite crystal that we're using as our icon for hydro fountains, the fossilized hydro fountains is another example that's used in the book. Okay? And since I've done some fun experiments with it, I showed you more on that. But hopefully the rest of these will go a little faster here. So the sand mark is the second mark of the flood. And so I'll go ahead and pass around these little vials. I've got some pink coral sand from the pink coral sand dunes in southern Utah, as well as just kind of some regular sand that you might see other places that has both black and white components too, as we'll see in one of my pictures here. On those pink coral sand dunes, it's interesting when you look at it under a microscope, which is what this is picturing, you can actually see that these are basically quartz-based crystals, right? And they've been rounded from some erosion activity, right? So they're kind of smooth and rounded, like river rocks. But they're basically quartz crystals. And the pink or orangish coloration of them is actually from iron oxide that gets on them. So that's, and so, like modern science says that sand erodes from the mountains, right? But, where do you have clear quartz mountains? Or orange pink ones that have a little iron oxide in them, right? So this is what we say happens with the sand. Again, it's kind of suspended in the solution because the silica is dissolving down here where the faults and the earthquake activity on the crust of the earth is happening. That's where there's a lot of heat. And so the hotter water in that area dissolves more sand or silica. And then as that's still getting spewed up into the floodwaters here, then the it starts to crystallize and grow larger and larger to the size of sand until it gets out of the main flow and falls out of solution. So that sand is forming here deep enough under the waters of the flood that it can crystallize, but not on the surface. Okay? And so that actually explains better than modern science, because then you can have huge fields of sand, right? You've got sand dunes that are humongous, and it's because of that. This is another interesting sand from Carlsbad Beach in San Diego. There's pure quartz crystals as well as ones with iron oxide. Here they look a little more yellowish, or orange, I guess. So you can see ones that are mostly clear quartz and others that have the orangish iron oxide on. And then the black particles here are interesting because that's black iron particles. And so this is somebody holding the sand. This is a magnified picture of that same sand. And so that's magnified iron particles. And then this up here is a magnet that has, at the very top, it's a magnet that's picked up. So they ran the magnet through some of the sand, and it picked up all these iron particles of magnetite, as it's called. So again, maybe that black, I haven't run the magnet through that sand that has the black particles in to check it out, but if it's like this one, would be able to pick those up. Okay, so these are some other experiments that were done in the universal model and are talked about and reported on in the universal model, where they took fine sand and they put that fine sand into a little tube and put cloth on each end, and had it on the wire, just going into the same kind of reactor or autoclave like we saw with that quartz experiment. And then afterwards, you can see quartz crystals growing on the screen. See the little pieces sticking up there, little quartz crystals growing out of the screens. And once they take those screens off, then it forms sandstone inside the pipe. So the screens on the end allowed the water to flow through the pipes so that the water with silica-rich minerals could flow through there, and it's the silica in the water that's dissolved that is then actually starting to form crystals between the sand grains and then making sandstone. And you can do a similar experiment without that high pressure, but then if you put it in water, it'll fall apart. And so you have to have the high pressure, and so that's why they have this final jar over here on the right, no dissolving since 2005. So it's still stuck together as sandstone because there's quartz crystals holding it together, and the quartz crystals aren't going to dissolve, right? Salt or silica that's not cemented can. So here's some fundamental questions. Where are the rivers transporting the gypsum sand that's to the mountains, right? It's not the same color as anything around it. So how did it get there? And if there was rain over millions of years, this gypsum is a form of salt, so it would actually dissolve over millions of years, but it hasn't, so it hasn't been that long. And that erosion question actually kind of goes into the next mark of the flood. And I like this picture because look at these black mountains with this clear white crystals, white quartz crystals of sand. So how does that happen? So it didn't happen from erosion. It happened in the flood. But it does lead us into the erosion mark, which is the next mark in the flood. And like this giant boulder is all round, so it had to get rounded out somewhere, probably deep down in the earth, as it's banging its way up through that Hydra fountain pipe, hole, tube, and then finally getting thrown out of the tube, and then landing and cracking open when it hits the surface. But there's not a pile of granite eroded here at the bottom of these, right? So they couldn't have been shaped by erosion where they are landed after they were ejected from Hydra fountains, and they haven't been here for millions of years like the modern scientists would suggest, because there's not a pile of erosion underneath them. Okay, so the erosion mark is basically saying, well, it didn't erode, it hasn't eroded very much, and so we don't really think that erosion is what's the biggest factor here. So here I have a piece of petrified wood, which is the rock that I picked to help us remember the erosion mark. The inside here is very rough, as you'll see as I pass it around. The outside, where the bark was, much smoother. Okay, that's shown down here at the bottom, inset. And then I also have an inset up here at the top left that is this lighter colored piece of petrified wood that happens to come from Indonesia. So we've got a few different samples that we can pass around. This one's some pink coral-like too, so we'll go ahead and pass those around. So on most sandstone, like even the little ones at the bottom there, they have very sharp edges. So, and I recently took a trip to the petrified forest, and you know, these trees, when they fell over, because they're rock and they're heavy, they broke, and most of them broke straight across. Looks like they were cut, but they're broken with hard, sharp edges, so to speak, just like it was cut across, like this one from Indonesia in a way. Of course, that one's polished too, but those sharp edges still remain to this day. And if it had been there for millions of years, like modern scientists would want us to think, then it would have eroded more. And there would be a pile, like here. You can see there's a little bit of erosion down here at the bottom of this log. And that's where you can see what I was saying about it being, looks like they were cut. But you can see it's just because when it fell over, it cracked open. Or cracked so that it's broken apart. So broken with sharp edges and very little erosion. Okay, you understand? So, yeah.
Do they find the actual roots of the trees nearby, like still in the ground?
So, generally speaking, on petrified logs, the roots did not get petrified because they were down in the ground. And so the trees under 5 miles of water changed to, you know, the silica was pushed into those, the trunks of the trees, but for the most part, the roots didn't.
Because they were in the ground?
Because they,
for the pressure?
Because they were in the ground, and so the silica from the flood wasn't able to get that deep to them.
It's kind of like putting painter's tape
Partially.
on the wall and painting over it, and then the ground is protecting the roots underneath the ground.
Exactly, yeah.
That's another sign, you know.
Right.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And on my Facebook page, there is a picture where it has the whole tree, and you can see like the top part of the root system. But
that's the part that like probably came out as the water
it
out.
Yeah, it could have came out, or it was, you know, shallow enough that like the base of the tree starts to go out, right? So there was part of it that was fossilized, but yeah, the whole root system didn't get fossilized, just the very top part, yeah.
When the trees break if it's under 5 miles of water?
So that's a good question. They're getting pressurized. The pressure is forcing the minerals into the wood, into the cells of the wood, and then each of those cells is kind of like a little geode where the crystals start forming inside the cells. So the wood is actually being replaced by stone, which isn't going to get hurt by the pressure.
And the pressure would help hold it together.
Yeah. So it depends on kind of exactly what's happening in that area of the world when the flood happened. Because like when we get to coal, that may have been smashed and kind of washed into one area, buried together. But like here in the petrified forest, a lot of those would have been standing originally, where they were fossilized. So did I answer your question? Okay, good.
How do they get petrified in a whole tree shape? How come they're all
For the most part, they are petrified in a whole tree, but sometime they fell down and broke and just cracked into a bunch of pieces.
Oh, do we have pictures of whole trees?
So yeah, you can.
Trees?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. On my Facebook page, there's one where it's
Log, but I mean like a whole tree.
yeah.
Oh, that's I think a live tree.
There's one on my Facebook page where we went on a tour and all of us stood on top of it, and it was at least 30 feet long, I think. So it was at least mostly. Just too much weight. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. I guess the weight and wind and erosion.
Yeah,
And it doesn't.
turned to stone, and then the root can't handle a stone tree all of a sudden. So it pulled over,
Yeah.
pulled out the root system, and then the roots either petrified in its own place, or they just eroded, they dissolved, they decomposed.
Decomposed. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's left.
Yeah. So if you have a big stone pillar there that was a tree, the roots are wood. Eventually, they're going to decay, and so it doesn't have a very stable base to stand on.
Oh, maybe when the water receded.
Maybe when the water receded, they fell. Yeah. But there certainly was more standing, and there are places in the world where you can find ones that are still standing. You also find some that have been encased in sediment. Up in Washington, I was reading a report about an area where he has, it's like this mountain, I guess, and there's a whole forest of trees down in there. So hopefully it'll give us more opportunities to study it. Okay, so I used the petrified wood to help us remember the erosion mark because it has sharp edges that have not been eroded for millions of years, okay? But arch formations is another one because we don't have piles and piles of rubble down here at the bottom. After the flood, this washed this arch out, and it washed all of the debris that would have come from under this arch out, except for the amount that would have happened in the last 4,000 years. Okay? Erosion also has to do with canyons, and it exists all over the world. All we have to do is look for it. So both the fact that we have deep canyons from that water washing a lot of sediment out quickly, forming big canyons, or the fact that we have flat plains where there's not a lot of erosion today. Okay. All right, the depth mark is the next one. And remember, we're thinking of it moving from eroding down towards the depths. And the rocks that we used, it actually explains the true origin of obsidian and basalt. And these are usually thought of as volcanic rocks or igneous rocks. But we would suggest otherwise. Well, I guess we would suggest that they're from a melt, but that they formed under the flood, I guess. So this one here is basalt, and it's a black. The thing to notice is that it's very dense, whereas a volcanic rock that we see today that cools on the surface of the earth, it has a lot of holes in it. Some of them will even float like pumice, because it'll float because it has so many holes that it's lighter than water, right, or less dense than water. And so those holes or vesicles form because the steam is escaping from inside that lava. But in this basalt, it's very coarse, very fine grain, not usually any holes in it, and that's because it was under pressure when it cooled and dried and turned into basalt. So it would be an ancient lava, but it was lava that came out under the flood, and so it's cooling as basalt with a very fine grain. And then these other pieces, and you can take them out of the bags if you want, but these are obsidian. One is rounded like an Apache tear, as you can see over there, and the others are more sharp-edged because they've been broken. Like sometimes they make arrowheads out of obsidian. And it has a unique fracture pattern, kind of rainbow-shaped fracture pattern that is good for making sharp edges. Okay, so modern science believes that obsidian is commonly formed by silica melts that are quenched in air. A shiny, usually black volcanic glass, obsidian forms above ground from lava that is similar in composition to the magma from which the granite forms underground, but cools so quickly that minerals do not have a chance to form within it. That's what modern science says. Okay? But, and I probably should go ahead and pass around some granite. So they're saying that this cooled underground from a melt, but that's not glass either. Granite is unique because it has no fossils in it. And so it actually formed before the flood. But they're making that connection. So we've done some experiments. Let's see, I wonder if I got a slide on that, hopefully. Okay, so this is showing you basalt and obsidian formation in hyperthermal conditions, so at least 3,000 meters below the surface of the oceans, all right, so that no vesicles form, none of those holes. And so here's a basalt flow, and it's forming basalt columns, which we find basalt in columns a lot of times. And an obsidian flow, high silica content in those. So that's how we're saying that the volcanic rock became obsidian or basalt. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, and it's interesting, the oceanic crust is mafic, or it's the dark-colored rocks like basalt or gabbro, okay? So basalt we find commonly in the bottom of the ocean, which kind of makes sense if you have volcanoes erupting along the fault lines in the bottom of the ocean and drying and hardening into basalt, okay? But the continental crust is very different and much thicker as it shows here, but it's mostly light-colored rocks like granite that is felsic. Okay. And this is showing us the experiment. I thought I had it because to put in the rock kits that we make, we usually take a little piece of granite or a little piece of basalt, and we melt one edge of it. So I'll pass that around, and you should feel it. The basalt feels a little more like sandpaper, but the melted part feels like glass. It's smooth. And that's because it's been melted, okay? And so it has a similar composition to the obsidian, right? But it dried at air temperature because it was just melted here with a torch. Okay? And so most of the rocks on the surface of the earth didn't come from a melt, because then we would be walking on glass. Okay? So the rocks that did come from a melt, like basalt and obsidian, they tended to form underneath the flood, or at least a lot of water in the flood. Okay, so that's a little close-up of that, like that piece that I'm passing around, showing you how the basalt is fine-grained, but when we melt it, it produces the glass. And this is just showing you another rock that has the vesicles because it cooled and the steam escaped. So they're made in water.
When you move this, you see little glitter pieces. Like, what's that?
Yeah, so it's granite is made of feldspar and quartz and let's see, what's the other one? Let's see those sheets. So I think it's mica is the other one, and I think that's what's the glittery element. Yeah, thank you.
Did you say that they find no fossils in granite?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that was here before the flood, before fossils were formed. Yeah.
I wonder if there's a way to get a melt of the salt and put into that hydrotherm experiment to see if it ends up turning back into the salt.
Ooh, wow. That's a great idea. That would be cool. Yeah, that would be neat. We got to try that. Okay. Are we ready to go on to carbonate mark? Okay, and again, the way we're remembering the next two is because they're white. So the carbonate is this surface. You can see it's a pretty thick surface of white material attached to this rock, and it's on one side. So the carbonate mark here, and here's another rock. You can see very clearly that it is only on one side of the rock. And it's interesting, if you find these rocks, they tend to be with the white side down. Okay? So that should help tell us kind of how these formed. So the carbonate material comes from microorganisms, kind of like coral, or like the, you can think of it like the skeletons of little microorganisms. And they're trying to find a place where they can be safe and survive. So these probably, towards the end of the flood, as the water is starting to dry out, right? The bacteria or microorganisms that these came from, they needed a moist, wet place to continue to multiply and grow. And so they climbed under the rocks, and so they're in between the rock and the mud. And so it's still a nice, moist, wet environment where they can continue to proliferate and grow and attach to the rock. Yeah, so, okay. Yeah, I guess that's one way to look at it. It's like a cemetery for all those microorganisms. Okay. And I wanted to find another piece here. Let's see. I'm going to pass these bottom ones down here. They have some fossils in them because it's more like the carbonate mark as a surface mark is the ones that I passed around first. But this is kind of like a chunk of carbonate. And that chunk of carbonate, if you look at it closely, you'll see little shells or the imprints from the shells in a few places as you look around it. Okay? So, again, a lot of critters form that. Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay, so the carbon cycle pseudotheory basically says the carbon in the world had to come from the sun making carbon in plants, right? And then the plants use the carbon. We breathe out carbon, they breathe in carbon, right? The problem is there's no carbon in igneous rocks, as this chart on the right is pointing out. And there's a lot of carbon in deposits in the earth, so much that we're suggesting that they're saying there's about 150 is the figure for the amount of carbon in sediment, and we're saying that number should be more like 78 million. Because there's huge carbon deposits in limestones and loess and other rocks that have a high carbon content in throughout the world. So the microbes produce the calcium carbonate. So we call it the carbonate mark, but it's calcium carbonate. In these deposits, and so those are formed by bacteria and algae, and science has long held belief that life on the earth is fueled by sunlight, but new discoveries are finding that you can have microorganisms that exist deep inside the earth and down in the bottom of the oceans where there's no sunlight. This is showing a bloom of bacteria or phytoplankton blooms in the oceans, and those would have been frequent during the flood, right? Lots of microorganisms proliferating in the warm waters of the flood. All right, then the salt mark. One of the things to notice on the salt mark is that this big chunk of salt here doesn't have a bunch of lines in it, because if it was a shallow ocean that came in and then evaporated, we'd have a very thin layer of salt, and then dust, maybe even plants would grow through that. Animals would track all over it, right? And then a new ocean would come in, and then a thin layer, but we'd have dust layers or dirt between all the layers of the salt. But we have huge chunks of salt. In fact, the largest mineral in the world, you want to guess what it is? It's salt. It's a salt dome. Avery Island Salt Dome, they've measured going down at least 35,000 feet, so that's more than Mount Everest is tall, but it's going down deep into the ground. These salt domes is almost pure salt, just like this chunk that I'm passing around. And so it didn't form in over millions of years with evaporation, right? That would just take way too long. We actually the United States stores its oil in these salt domes, and this is showing you these little blue columns up at the top here. those are little tubes that they've hollowed out in the salt domes to store our petroleum reserves. So it's like a giant barrel, right? And we've got enough oil stored in those to fuel all the cars in the United States for a year or two, I think. And you can see they're barely scratching the surface because this salt dome goes down a whole lot farther. And notice the shape of the salt dome is a diatreme. So where do you think the diatreme came from? A Hydra fountain, right? Okay. So
I have
Yep.
a question on those.
Good.
On the dome, how come, like the pillars of the sandstone, how come everything around it didn't wash away after the flood? How come, if you go back to the previous slide, why is there a shape like that of different layers around the salt dome?
So this one didn't, the dirt around it didn't get washed away. For one, because it's so big and so deep, right? But so this is even much bigger than the petrified pillars that I was showing earlier. And because those are probably rocks and stuff around it too. So and maybe because the surface got if the surface got crystallized into sandstone, then that would keep it from getting washed away. Whereas if it was just mud around the other ones, maybe they got washed away. That's kind of how it's.
How come the layers form the way they do around the salt? Like there's oil.
Yeah, you do often find oil and gas near salt domes, and it's interesting. They're near craters, which most of modern science says happened from a meteorite impact. So, why does all the salt and oil, all the oil and gas, seem to be found by meteorites? But that's what some geologists think is happening. But it's because then you get the conditions of the flood in there, so that you have microorganisms. Because we're suggesting that the microorganisms are putting this salt pillar together and helping to form the salt pillar. And microorganisms are also forming your fossil fuels. Okay, so that's why. And that's actually going to lead us into our next one. This is a gypsum crystal. Again, this is found on the surface, but it's kind of a salt and sand sculpture that we find on the surface. Interesting crystal. So oil and gas mark, we led right into that nicely. Here's my oil can and my little vial of gas. Natural gases. So like this quote here, the key to the geology of the Gulf region is a thorough knowledge and familiarization with the geology of salt domes, because they're often found in next to each other. And the reason is because of the flood. So oil and gas mark, those are your clues for your test at the end. And so natural gas is mainly methane, which is CH4. It's a hydrocarbon. Or all of these are hydrocarbons that occur naturally. It may include ethane, butane, propane, pentanes, and then you also can have hydrogen sulfide. So gases, and even natural gas doesn't smell bad. Normally, they actually add the sulfur ingredient that makes it smell like rotten eggs. So that's the natural gas. And of course, oil, we're talking crude oil actually, rather than your car oil. But of course, crude oil was what we get gasoline from, and other oils. Okay, then we go to coal. And again, you can remember this because these are other fossil fuels as we consider them. And you can get these out of the bags if you want to look at them and handle them. So here's a big chunk of coal. Here's our icons, some kind of rough pieces. And some coal deposits, you can actually see the prints, like in this one, there's the print of the fern that is in it. But there's other coal deposits where you can see other parts of trees. And so basically coal formed during the flood because like a whole forest kind of smashed under the pressure of the flood so that it would be pressed all together, all that plant-based material, and turn into coal. So it burns nicely, right, like wood does, even though it's changed to coal. Okay, and they found pine cones and tree logs in it, as that said. All right, any questions about that? Okay. So, so we're going on then to the pyrite mark, and pyrite is interesting. So the next two we think of as metals. They look valuable, right? Doesn't that look valuable to you? Would you like to have a chunk of that, right? So what does it look like? Gold, all right, yeah. But it actually is pyrite. Pyrite is actually fool's gold, so sorry. It appears to look like gold and appears to look valuable, but in this case, the pyrite is not very valuable. But these are kind of cool specimens. This cube at the top in that picture is actually in the rock that it was taken out of the ground in. So there's a mine in Spain where this came from, and this is still in the rock that it was dug out with. Okay, so this is these pyrite cubes that you see in the center here are naturally occurring cubes that form in that shape. So just like a salt crystal forms into a cube, pyrite forms into a cube. So different crystals have different characteristic shapes, like the fluorite had that double pyramid shape. Quartz crystals have a pointy shape that's pretty characteristic. And pyrite can form into a cube like these. And then it settled into a sediment that also turned to stone sometime during the flood. Okay?
So is pyrite a floater or is it attached?
So I believe that it was a floater that settled into a sediment that then hardened into stone.
That's a good question, 'cause I always wondered how in the world did it get there.
But it is good. So I think it was free floating when it formed into a cube, and then it settled into sediment, and then that sediment was crystallized into stone. That's okay. So I do have a little piece of sulfur here because sulfur may smell bad, but it gives the yellow color to the pyrite. So that's what makes it look like gold. So I went ahead and put a little piece in there. And I have some if you want to smell it afterwards.
So what's the mineral composition of pyrite?
It is silica dioxide, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Does it have
I'm pretty sure.
iron in it? Like, is that
So
iron
it-
pyrite, is iron pyrite the same thing?
Yeah, so it does have iron in it too, and it has sulfur. Oh, so it's actually not silica dioxide because that's quartz.
I just Googled it.
So, yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, so anyway, a lot of different shapes and forms here. The one on the right here usually has like a octagonal or tetrahedral shape to it. And then this one, I think, was kind of rolling around on the bottom of the flood, maybe, because it kind of got smoothed out on the outside. This one is called the Pyrite Sun, which I can show you in the next slide here. This is a Pyrite Sun actually still embedded in the coal that it was found in. Pyrite suns were often found in coal mines, and the miners would dig them out and put them in their lunchbox and bring them home to their kids because they look cool, but they're not very valuable to the coal mine. But anyway, so they formed in the same environment, and I kind of look at that as a giant colony, like a bacterial colony. In fact, I saw a picture of one the other day that had those radiating lines and circles. I probably should have set that in here. So I kind of see that as being formed by microorganisms during the flood in a colony where it's growing like mold does in a roundish shape, right? Not exactly round, but roundish. And you can see it's kind of like one layer and then another. So like see here's where it grew originally, and then it extended out in a larger area. So we'll pass that around as well. So that's my Pyrite Sun. Oh, yeah, iron and sulfur. Did I say that? What?
Yeah, it's iron and sulfur. Yeah, it is, yeah.
Okay. All right. So, again, naturally forming cubes, and the melting point is low enough that it would be nearly impossible to cut and polish these to look this way. So that's formed naturally in a hypertherm. Yeah. I actually called up the author when I was talking about the Pyrite mystery and said, hey, could this be cut and polished? And he said, I don't know, let me see. And he took one of his little cubes and he took it to his bandsaw and tried to cut it, and it just kind of melted into pieces. So it was like in 8 different pieces because it all kind of fell apart, getting too hot trying to cut it. So, all right, so pyrite, because it's fool's gold, and makes us think, oh, this is that one that was rolling around, so I'll pass that around. So that fool's gold makes us think of the ores that are natural minerals. The greenish is from copper-based minerals that have oxidized, and you can see little specks that may be silver, maybe gold. It may be pyrite, I'm not sure, but those are ore minerals. And one of the things you should definitely notice, like when I hand this to you, let me go ahead and hand it to you here, right? It's very heavy, right? Because that iron, those heavy metals, those precious metals, gold, silver, copper, are very dense and very heavy. So you'll notice that as you pass that chunk around. Yeah, it's full of it. All right. Yeah. Okay. And let's see, I should grab some copper. Okay, so these are from some copper mines here in Arizona. These greenish copper ores. Okay, like you have at the bottom of this picture. Okay, so when copper oxidizes, it turns green. We know that from the Statue of Liberty. Okay, so here's Tag Mound. It's an ore factory. The result of drilling at the Tag Mound is one of those hydrothermal vents down in the bottom of the ocean. And so it represents a significant step forward in our understanding of how some of the large base metal ore deposits on land were formed at the sea floor. Okay? Because they're finding, see, here's pyrite up near the top of this diatreme. They're finding anhydrite. They're finding quartz down a little deeper. And so the water is flowing up and out, forming these black smokers, and there's also white smokers. And so these now that have found these hydrothermal vents down in the bottom of the ocean, we're really learning a lot about minerals and how they form, because it's getting us closer to the conditions. Now, this is the Superior Arizona ore mine, a natural ore producing factories with diatremes this large, right? You picture this as a great big diatreme, right? We've dug out the hole where all that mineral formed, but that means that this was once at the bottom of an ocean during the flood, and all these ores were forming at the top of that diatreme, just like they are at Tag Mound today, right? So picture those two as basically the same thing, but that was in the bottom of the flood, and so it was a great big diatreme. Okay, ready to go on surface mark unless there's other questions. Okay, surface mark, again, there's quite a few. The ones that I'm going to talk about are these two. On the left of these pictures, there's the surface chalcedony. And so we'll pass around these samples of surface chalcedony. You'll notice, and the reason I have the pictures on the right is showing you the bottom of the same rocks that are on the left. So the top part is the milky quartz that looks really pretty, and on the bottom it's dirty or even rocky. Okay? And you can see that in these samples. So the microbes are probably helping to form these in little bunches, but it's crystallizing on the surface of the ground underneath the flood. So you can go out in the Arizona desert and find these, right? Most of these are found in Arizona, although I do have some, like the one in the center there that looks kind of like an eyeball is one from Madagascar, and but it's called chalcedony also. And this is my sample here that I'll pass around, similar. And then here's one that's a pretty crystally version. But you can see one side's very dull and dark, rocky, and the crystals are growing up and off of the rock. Okay? And yet they're found on the surface of the ground today. So, and then the other surface mark that I want to talk about is one that we see a lot in landscaping, because it's rocks that have black on the outside, but if you crack them open, they have a lighter colored rock on the inside. And so, like this one, you have the bottom is reddish, and that was like in the mud, the red muds, and so it's stained red on the bottom. The top has what we call desert varnish, and it's kind of like the magnetite. So it's an iron-rich deposit that is stuck on the outside, the top surface of these rocks. So as you look at this, you can see black top, lighter on the inside, and the reddish on the bottom is how these are found. And so my students help me crack a lot of these open. And so those are the ones on the right side of these pictures. Okay?
Did you say these are part of the surface mark?
Yes, that's chalcedony. The other pieces I passed of chalcedony are from Arizona. That one happens to be from Madagascar. And, just a very different, interesting-looking piece of chalcedony. Here's some pictures of surface chalcedony from the book. The top side, again, they have it switched on the opposite sides. Here's milky quartz-like chalcedony on the top of a rock, and these have the crystal side up. That looks like one of the ones that I passed last in the bag. That's real pretty crystals. And then the bottom was either attached to rock or to dirt and is dirty looking.
Still quite cool.
What?
That's still quite cool.
But yeah, very cool. Yeah, it has an interesting shape and everything to it. The interesting thing about this is going back to Tag Mound, which again is in the bottom of the ocean, we're finding length-fast chalcedony occurs in the outer low temperature envelope across the top and sides of the mound. So these little black dots and stuff around here is actually surface chalcedony. And so we know the conditions as this chalcedony forms in, that forms in hot, deep ocean waters. So, the flood, right? So all the chalcedony that we're finding on the surface of Arizona, and there's dozens of places that you can go rock hounding and pick this stuff up, was on the bottom of a flood, an ocean-like flood, okay? So that's pretty significant. This is my students cracking up the desert varnish rocks open. And so let me show you here that here's rock varnish trace elements. And so they're mapping out, along the bottom here are the elements that are in it. And so they're comparing it with the South Pacific Ocean floor with the iron, Fe is ferrous or iron, and magnesium. So it's an iron-magnesium crust that they're finding, but we're also finding it in Death Valley, Mojave Desert. So all of these samples are being found, and that desert rock varnish is being found, and it has a similar comparison to the South Pacific Ocean floor. Okay? So, and yet you can go out in Arizona and find fields of these rocks that have the black varnish on. Okay, we'll go on to the diamond mark. So I'll pass around these nice diamond samples. These ones are probably cubic zirconium, but I like to put them in my rock kit just to make it look like we got diamonds. So diamonds, they are hard, right? We all know that diamond is the hardest crystal in the world, right? And and we use it to cut concrete and steel and a lot of other stuff, right? So the reason it's so hard is because it was formed under more pressure, because it formed deeper down in the diatreme. So we're on to the prepositions, right? The surface marks, we had chalcedony and desert varnish that are surface marks that are on top of the rocks and on top of the surface of the ground at the bottom of the ocean or flood. This is forming deeper down inside the diatremes, deep in the earth. And this is kilometers, so here's 1 and 2 kilometers deep in these kimberlite mines. So now we're talking 6 or 7 miles of flood water above them when the diamonds are being formed, right? Okay, any questions about that? Because then I'm going to go on to the inclusion mark. Now the inclusion is that there's something inside the rocks or crystals that is included inside them. Right? So we have on, below, or inside. And so this is an amethyst crystal. Again, very characteristic shape, kind of like a quartz crystal. Amethyst and quartz are very closely related. The amethyst, of course, has a slightly purplish hue to it. And actually, if we pass around, get a light to it. Okay. Yeah, why don't you put a light under that? You can see it a little easier, but on this surface right over here, there's water inside this crystal, and you can wiggle it back and forth and see that if you put it under a light. So, okay, so we're looking right here on this side here. Do you see the water bubble moving in there? Okay. So go ahead and pass that around, and you can wiggle it around there and see that water that's trapped inside the crystal. So obviously the crystal formed in water, and it actually trapped or encased some of the water inside the crystal. And I have some others here that are more like this one that are rounded. Let me get them out of the bag here. What I suggest you do with these is if you hold them by the edges, hold them in your fingers real firmly so you don't drop them, but then shake it close to your ear. It's not so much that you hear it, but you'll kind of feel it. And there's water inside those as well. And then you should also use the light on those too. So if you can use the light to look at those, you'll see the water through those. This is actually a man-made anhydro. These crystals are called anhydros because they have the water trapped inside. Okay. So on the inclusion evidence, here's some other ones. I'll go ahead and pass around the one on the right there. It shows you where the water is found in two little chambers, and that one. So such inclusion provides a sample of the growth environment by entrapping the solution of the density and mineralizer concentration present at the time of crystallization. So we know what that water was like. Fluid inclusions with organic gases, and sometimes they have little bits of oil or organic material in there. So where did this water come from? The flood, you're right. So that's pretty exciting to think that we actually have water from the flood trapped inside these crystals when they form. So Noah's flood is a fact. You've learned all the 13 marks of the flood and this little mnemonic device to help you remember all of them. And so hopefully you're ready for the test. Okay? Yeah.
Well, has anyone cracked one of these open and tested the water to see if it's different?
Yeah, I think they have. So, so it is interesting. I don't know the results from off the top of my head, but yeah. Yeah. I also had on my Facebook page, Do True Science, one where they had a big geode about this big, and they cracked it open, and there was a whole bunch of water that came out inside. So that's an interesting video. Okay, so can you all yell out? Okay, we're just before we end here, I know we're kind of out of time, but I'd like you all to try the test, and I'd like you to shout out what the this is what you should be shouting out, is the name of the mark of the flood as we go through the quiz here. So we have suspended floaters with no rock attached. Over on the right, we have fluorite, which is a mark of Hydra fountains. Very good. Okay. And on the left, we have what? Sand, right. That's and we have it magnified there at the bottom with the pink coral sand. Okay, very good. You're getting 100% so far. So we said that this was moving. On the left, we have the petrified wood, which represents Erosion. And on the right we have basalt and obsidian, which represents depth, right? Because they're igneous rocks that form deep in the depths. Okay, over on the left we have,
On the left, on our left,
on your left,
we have
carbonate, right? Microorganisms were forming that carbonate. And on the right we have salt. All right. Okay. You guys are getting 100% so far. On the left we have oil and gas. And on the right we have coal. Very good. So they're all fossil fuels. All right. On the left we have Pyrite, which is the name of that mark. It appears to be valuable because it's fool's gold. And on the right we have ore, right? Whether it's gold, copper, or silver ore. Yeah. All right. And then our last is the prepositions. So on, what's that? It's the surface mark. You're right. And we had surface chalcedony and the desert varnish that's black. Then at the bottom here, we have what was formed below, which is diamonds. All right. And on the right, we have inside, they're hydro in hydros because they have the water inside them. And so it's what's the name of the mark? Do you remember? Inclusion. Very good. All right. You guys got 100%. This is awesome. Give yourselves a hand. It is diamond. Yeah, it is diamond.
Is there one called the depth mark?
So depth is the one for basalt and obsidian. Yep.
That's deeper than that.
So, yeah, this is even deeper than that depth. Right. Because it's deeper down in the diatremes. That's where you find the diamonds. So, all those D's to help you remember it.
Is there anything else that we found that deep with the diamonds?
No, I don't think so. Bedrock. Yeah, I guess that would be. There's got to be some granite down there, huh? Okay. All right, so, oops. Those weren't supposed to be there. All right, so special thanks to Darren Klepp for a video recording for us. Please visit Do True Science on Facebook and YouTube. This video will be posted on our YouTube channel, which is Do True Science. And then I also put pictures from our experiments and stuff on Facebook with my experimental class that you saw some of. And universalmodel.com is where you can buy the book, The Universal Model. This is Volume 1, which is all about the Earth system. And I recently was on there, and they've just put up the Volume 2. You can pre-order Volume 2 in print. It's been available digitally, but they've sent the final copies to the printer, and so you can pre-order those. And they should be coming out here hopefully by the end of the year, but if not, first part of the next year, which is the living system, and that's where it talks about, where mankind came from. And it talks more about fossils and disputes evolution. And then Volume 3 will be the universe system. All three of those systems are talked about in the summary book. This is just a quick little summary that's nice to have. So any questions on anything we've covered before we wrap it up here? Okay. All right. So thank you very much. This is just going through some of the things. You can get rock kits. All those things are available at universalmodel.com. So thank you.